That highly sensitive child, could be turning into a full-blown narcissist right now. And what's truly disturbing, their parents probably think they're doing the right thing. Carl Jung. That name should be synonymous with childhood development. He uncovered something that should have revolutionized how we raise our kids. But this vital truth has remained buried for decades. Extreme sensitivity isn't weakness. It's precisely what makes them a perfect target. When a child feels everything, they perceive things that the adults around them would rather keep hidden. And for unconscious parents, this represents a threat. What happens next is what Carl Jung termed psychological murder. Not with knives, not with shouting, but with something far more devastating, with systematic invalidation, with the constant ridicule of their inherent sensitivity, with a message repeated thousands of times. You're too sensitive, and that's a problem. The sensitive child doesn't want to become cold. They are forced into it in order to survive. You've probably met someone like this. Maybe a childhood friend who was the most empathetic kid you knew and now seems incapable of displaying any genuine emotion. Perhaps a family member who cried at everything as a kid and now possesses a coldness that's frankly terrifying. Or maybe, just maybe, it's you, looking back. Remembering who you were before you learned that feeling was dangerous, before constructing that armor that now feels impossible to remove. The connection between childhood sensitivity and adult narcissism isn't coincidence. It's a pattern that Jung identified, meticulously, after studying the human psyche for decades. And today, we're going to dismantle this mechanism, piece by piece, because understanding how the wound occurred is the first step toward healing it, the pain you carry. If you were one of those children, has a specific name in Jungian psychology. It's called amputation of the feeling function. This isn't a metaphor. It's exactly what happens when a part of your psyche is systematically attacked, until you effectively kill it to survive. Imagine your capacity to feel is like a limb on your body. In the early years of your life, that part is alive, functioning, connecting you to the world in a way that few adults can even fathom. The sensitive child senses their mother's sadness before she utters a single word. They perceive their father's anger still in the garage before he even enters the house. They absorb the emotions of their siblings, their grandparents, even strangers at the grocery store. This isn't imagination. This is the feeling function operating at its maximum capacity. It should be celebrated. It should be protected. But for unconscious parents, often consumed by their own unresolved complexes, this sensitivity represents something completely different. It represents a mirror. And the mirror shows things they've spent their entire lives avoiding. The mother who buried her own sensitivity to survive her childhood can't tolerate seeing her daughter cry over a dead bird, not because she doesn't care, but because those tears activate something inside her that she swore she'd never feel again. The father who learned that men don't cry can't handle a son who feels fear or sadness, not because he's cruel, but because every tear from his son is a painful reminder of the boy he himself murdered within himself 30 years ago. Jung explained this phenomenon with disturbing clarity. We attack in others what we most hate in ourselves. The shadow always attacks the shadow. When parents invalidate a child's sensitivity, they aren't rejecting the child. They're rejecting the part of themselves that they had to kill to survive. The child merely functions as a screen for that projection. The transformation begins subtly, so subtly that no one notices until it's far too late. First comes the repeated invalidation. You're exaggerating. It was nothing. Stop crying over something so stupid. These phrases seem harmless, but for the sensitive child, each one is a small cut. And cuts accumulate. The child starts to doubt themselves. Am I really exaggerating? Are my emotions really stupid? This doubt is the first step in the process. The child still feels everything, but now they feel shame for feeling. Next comes the ridicule. This can be direct, with laughter when the child cries, or it can be subtle, with that disapproving look that communicates more than 1,000 words ever could. The child who once expressed their emotions freely starts to hide them, not because they've stopped feeling, but because they've learned that showing what they feel brings painful consequences. And here, something crucial happens. The child develops what Jung called a persona, a mask, a version of themselves that's acceptable to the external world. This persona can be many things. The class clown who uses humor to deflect attention from their true emotions, the perfect student who channels all their energy into academic performance, the rebel who transforms pain into anger, because anger is more acceptable than sadness. The problem arises when the persona becomes too rigid, when the mask sticks to the face, when the child forgets that the mask isn't them. And this brings us to the third stage, the dissociation from the feeling function. The sensitive child, after years of invalidation and ridicule, makes an unconscious decision. This decision is never verbalized, never conscious, but it's absolutely real. The decision is, if feeling hurts so much, then I'm going to stop feeling. And the human psyche, in its primitive wisdom of survival, obeys. The feeling function starts to be pushed into the shadow. The child doesn't stop feeling overnight. It's a gradual process. First, they stop crying in front of others. Then they stop crying alone. Then they forget how to cry. First, they stop expressing exuberant joy. Then they stop feeling exuberant joy. Then they forget that exuberant joy even exists. What remains is an emotional flatness, a life lived in shades of gray. And here is the paradox that few truly understand. The child who was too sensitive becomes the adult who seems to feel nothing. But the sensitivity hasn't died. It's merely been buried alive. Jung used a specific term for this phenomenon, enantiodromia. It means that when something is repressed forcefully enough, the psyche turns toward its opposite. The child who felt too much becomes the adult who apparently feels too little. But beneath the coldness, buried in the shadow, all that original sensitivity still exists, waiting, accumulating pressure, ready to explode in unexpected ways. The psyche doesn't allow anything to be truly destroyed, only transformed. And repressed sensitivity transforms into something monstrous when it isn't integrated consciously. And this explains something that confuses many therapists. Why do narcissists sometimes have emotional outbursts so intense? Why can someone who seems so cold suddenly react with disproportionate anger or collapse into uncontrollable weeping? Because the shadow always returns. Repressed sensitivity doesn't just vanish. It stays there, festering, growing in power, until it finds a crack to escape. And when it does escape, it comes with decades of accumulated intensity. Let me tell you about a boy named Ethan. That's not his real name, but his story is real. It's repeating itself in thousands of homes right now. Ethan was 4 years old when his parents realized he was different. He noticed things. He felt things. When his mom was sad, he'd go to her and hold her hand without saying a word. When his dad came home stressed from work, Ethan would stay quiet in the corner, as if he knew any movement could trigger an explosion. His grandparents said he had an old soul. His teachers said he was too mature for his age. His parents said he was too sensitive. And that last phrase, too sensitive, was never a compliment. It was a diagnosis, a concern, something to be corrected. Ethan's dad grew up in a house where emotions were forbidden. His own father was an alcoholic. The unwritten rule was clear: don't cry, don't complain, don't feel, survive. And Ethan's dad survived. But surviving came at a price. He amputated his own feeling function at 7 years old. When he got beaten for the last time for crying, he never cried again. He never truly felt again. He built a successful life on a foundation of coldness. And when he saw his son Ethan, at 4 years old, crying over a dog hit by a car in the street, he felt something he couldn't name. It was the ghost of a 7-year-old boy that he had murdered within himself 3 decades ago. Ethan's mom had her own story. She grew up being the highly sensitive child in a family that had no space for sensitivity. Her mom was a practical woman. Emotions were a luxury. There was work to be done, bills to be paid. Crying didn't solve anything. And so Ethan's mom learned the same lesson. Sensitivity is a burden, a weakness, something to be overcome. When she looked at Ethan, she saw herself at 4 years old, and instead of protecting that part in her son, she did what her parents did to her. She tried to correct it. Because if Ethan continued like this, the world would destroy him. Better for his parents to harden him now than for the world to break him later. Ethan learned quickly. Highly sensitive children always learn quickly because they perceive everything. They perceive the impatient sigh when they start to cry. They perceive the look exchanged between their parents that says, "Here we go again." By 5 years old, he already knew that his tears caused more problems than they solved. By 6, he had already developed techniques not to cry. He bit his tongue. He clenched his fists. He thought about something else. By 7, he barely needed the techniques. The tears simply stopped coming. His parents were relieved. The boy was maturing. He had finally learned to control his emotions. What they didn't know was that Ethan hadn't learned to control anything. He had learned to kill a part of himself that would never return in the same way. What replaces sensitivity? Carl Jung called this compensation. When a psychic function is repressed, another takes its place. In Ethan's case, the feeling function was replaced by the thinking function. He became extremely logical, analytical, rational, but no one sought him out to share a joy or a sadness, because everyone perceived that Ethan wasn't really there, that behind the intelligent eyes there was a void, the place where sensitivity used to live. Hold on, because the most important part comes now. Understanding how Ethan became like this is only half the story. The other half is understanding why this matters. And it matters because Ethan is not an isolated case. Ethan is a pattern that repeats itself in millions of homes. The highly sensitive child who becomes a narcissist isn't an exception. It's the rule in families where sensitivity is treated as a defect. Carl Jung identified 5 specific mechanisms by which parents destroy their children's sensitivity. And here is the part that will upset many people. None of these mechanisms look like abuse. They all look like normal parenting. They can all be justified with good intentions, and that makes them infinitely more dangerous. The first mechanism is systematic invalidation. This happens when parents consistently communicate that the child's emotions are exaggerated or wrong. "Stop crying, it was nothing." "You're being dramatic." "It's not that big of a deal." For the highly sensitive child, each of these phrases is a clear message. What you feel is wrong. You are wrong. Your inside is wrong. The second mechanism is ridicule. Unlike invalidation, which denies the emotions, ridicule turns them into a joke. The dad who imitates his son's crying in a high-pitched voice. The mom who tells the visitors how her son is such a crybaby. Ridicule is particularly destructive because it attacks not only the emotions, but the identity. This creates a primary narcissistic wound, a hole in the place where there should be a solid sense of self. The third mechanism is destructive comparison. "Why can't you be like your brother?" At your age, I had already learned to control my emotions. Comparisons always communicate the same message. You are not good enough as you are. And so the child begins to perform, to try to be who their parents want them to be, to build a false self that is acceptable, even if it means murdering the true self. The fourth mechanism is the punishment of vulnerability. The child who shows vulnerability is ignored. The child who hides vulnerability is rewarded. The child's brain quickly learns which behavior brings reward, and so the highly sensitive child learns to hide everything that is soft, fragile, vulnerable. The rigid persona begins to form. The fifth mechanism is perhaps the most insidious. It's the absence of positive mirroring of sensitivity. It's not enough not to invalidate. It is necessary to actively mirror sensitivity as something valuable. The child needs to see in their parents' eyes that their ability to feel deeply is a gift, not a defect. They need to hear that their empathy is admirable, that their ability to perceive other people's emotions is a strength, not a vulnerability. Without this positive mirroring, even parents who don't do anything actively harmful can create children who learn to reject their own sensitivity. Because the child doesn't intrinsically know what is valuable, they learn by looking at their parents. And if the parents never demonstrate that sensitivity matters, the child concludes that it doesn't matter. Ethan experienced all 5 mechanisms, not in a dramatic way, just in a daily, repeated, systematic way. His parents loved him. Truly. They wanted the best for him, and they thought they were preparing him for a hard world. They prepared him so well that he became as hard as the world. His parents yet won. They created an adult who would never again be hurt by feeling too deeply. But the price of that victory was the death of everything that made Lucas profoundly human. At 25, Lucas had a promising career and a succession of relationships that never lasted more than a few months. Women found him charming at first, but after a while, they all noticed the same thing. He wasn't really there. There was a distance, a coldness, an invisible wall that no one could break through. Remember when I said the shadow always returns? With Lucas, it was no different. At 30, he had his first crisis. It started with insomnia. Then came recurring nightmares in which he was a child again, crying alone in a dark room while no one came. During the day, he began to feel an irritability he couldn't explain. The repressed feeling function was returning, but because it was never processed, it came in a distorted form. It came as rage, as anxiety, as a sense of emptiness that no achievement could fill. The narcissism that emerges from repressed sensitivity isn't just about a lack of empathy. It's about a wound that never healed. The narcissist who was a highly sensitive child carries within themselves an unbearable contradiction. They feel too much and apparently feel nothing. They desperately crave connection and sabotage every true connection because deep down, there's a child convinced that their essence is defective, that if anyone really knew who they are inside, they'd reject them. Carl Jung said that everything we put in the shadow becomes our enemy. The sensitivity that Lucas buried at 7 years old didn't disappear. It stayed in the shadow, growing in power. When it finally began to emerge, it came as hypersensitivity to criticism. A single negative word could destroy his entire day. It came as an insatiable need for validation. It came as corrosive envy of people who seemed genuinely happy. Lucas didn't realize he was envying his own stolen capacity. The cure for this type of narcissism isn't easy. The 4-year-old child who decided to stop feeling can't be reached with logical arguments. They need to be found in the body, in the chronic tension of the shoulders, in the tightness of the chest, in the closed throat that doesn't allow for tears. Jung called this process shadow integration. It means going to find the highly sensitive child who was abandoned in the shadow and bringing them back into the light. It means feeling everything that was forbidden to feel. It means allowing yourself to be vulnerable. Even when every cell in your body screams that vulnerability is death, you've just discovered the most hidden mechanism of narcissism formation. Most people will never hear this. Most parents will continue to think they're preparing their highly sensitive children for the real world, when, in reality, they're destroying the only thing that could allow for true connection in adulthood. Each video like this costs hours of deep research into Jung, into developmental psychology, into childhood trauma. Information like this has been ignored for decades because it confronts something that no one wants to admit, that loving parents can create children incapable of loving. The super thanks down there isn't just financial support. It's you saying, this truth needs to be known. When you click that golden heart, you help liberate other highly sensitive children who can still be saved. You're not just a spectator. You're someone who cares about the next generation. Lucas started therapy at 32, not because he wanted to work on his repressed sensitivity. He didn't even know it existed. He started because he was having panic attacks. The therapist he found worked with a Jungian approach, and that detail made all the difference. In the first sessions, Lucas talked about his work, his failed relationships, his growing irritability. He spoke with the same analytical coldness he used for everything. The therapist listened, asked questions, and waited. He knew the shadow would eventually appear. The first breach came when the therapist asked about his childhood. Lucas began to recount the official narrative. Normal childhood, loving parents, no trauma. But as he spoke, his voice began to falter. His hands were clenched, his breathing was shallow. The therapist pointed this out gently. Lucas looked at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. He had never noticed he did that. In the following sessions, the therapist investigated the normal childhood narrative. What was it like when you cried as a child? What did your parents do? Lucas replied that he didn't remember crying much. But when he closed his eyes and tried to remember, an image came. He was 5 years old. He was in his room. He was crying. And then the door opened. His father came in, and Lucas stopped crying immediately. Not because his father consoled him, but because his father's look clearly communicated that crying was unacceptable. Lucas spent 40 minutes of that session in silence, processing, feeling, perhaps for the first time in decades, something he couldn't name. The recovery wasn't linear. There were weeks when he wanted to give up on therapy. Weeks when the anger was so intense that he couldn't function. Weeks when the old sadness completely overwhelmed him. The therapist explained that this was expected, that the shadow, when it begins to be integrated, doesn't come organized in convenient packages. It comes as a flood. The job wasn't to stop this flood. It was to create a safe container for it. One session in particular changed everything. The therapist asked Lucas to imagine his 4-year-old self, the highly sensitive child who perceived everything, felt everything, and hadn't yet learned that feeling was wrong. Lucas closed his eyes. At first, nothing came. But the therapist asked him to breathe, to relax, to wait. And then the image appeared. A little boy, big eyes, open expression, vulnerable in a way that the adult Lucas found almost intolerable to see. The therapist asked what the adult Lucas wanted to say to that child, and for the first time in decades, Lucas cried. Not a controlled cry, a full-body cry. Sobs that came from a place so deep that he didn't know existed. Between sobs, he said to the imaginary child, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for abandoning you. I'm sorry for believing them when they said you were too much. You weren't too much. You were perfect." That moment was the real beginning of the integration, not the end, just the beginning. Because integrating a part of the psyche that's been rejected for 30 years doesn't happen in one therapy session. It happens through thousands of small, daily choices. The choice to feel instead of anesthetize. The choice to be vulnerable instead of automatically protect yourself. The choice to admit that you're hurt instead of attacking. Each of these choices goes against decades of programming. Each one activates the primitive fear that vulnerability will result in abandonment, but each one also rebuilds, little by little, the bridge between the adult Lucas and the highly sensitive child he abandoned. Today, Lucas is 40 years old. He would say he's still in process, that there are still days when the old coldness returns automatically, that there are still moments when he catches himself wanting to protect himself instead of connecting, but he'd also say that for the first time in his life, he knows what it is to truly feel, that he can finally cry when something is sad and laugh when something is happy, that his relationships have a quality they never had before, a presence, a reality, that he finally feels alive. The narcissism hasn't disappeared completely, but now he can observe it, recognize it, and choose differently. The difference between unconsciousness and consciousness is the difference between being possessed by the complex and having the complex. Lucas finally has the complex, instead of being had by it. Lucas's story isn't uncommon. It's the story of thousands of people who were highly sensitive children, in families that had no space for sensitivity. Some of these people are watching this video now, recognizing themselves, feeling something they can't name. If you're one of them, I want you to know some important things. First, your sensitivity wasn't a defect. It was your greatest gift. The fact that you needed to hide it to survive doesn't mean it was wrong. It means the environment was inadequate for something so precious. Second, the coldness you developed isn't who you are. It's armor. Armor can be removed. When you're in a safe environment, the highly sensitive child is still there, waiting to be rescued. Third, healing is possible. It's not easy, it's not quick, but it is possible. It requires the courage to feel what was forbidden to feel. It requires finding safe people, qualified therapists, spaces where vulnerability is welcomed instead of punished. And for the parents who are watching, for those who have highly sensitive children and don't know what to do with so much emotion, please, listen. Your highly sensitive child doesn't need to be fixed. They need to be protected. Protected not from the world, but from yourselves. When you project your own unhealed wounds onto them, every time you invalidate an emotion, you teach them that feeling is wrong. Every time you ridicule sensitivity, you plant a seed of shame. That will grow for decades. The alternative isn't difficult. Just stop. Stop invalidating. Stop ridiculing. Stop comparing. And start mirroring. Is your child sad? Say you understand. That sadness is part of life. That you're there. Is your child crying? Don't tell them to stop. Sit beside them. Let the tears come. They'll stop on their own. When they've fulfilled their function, the next generation of narcissists is being created at this moment, in homes where sensitivity is treated as weakness, in families where emotions are inconvenient, in homes where children learn before they learn to read. That feeling too much is dangerous, and most parents who are doing this have no idea. They think they're preparing their children for the world. They think they're being good parents. They think toughness is love. They don't know they're transmitting the same complexes that they inherited from their own parents. They don't know they're perpetuating a cycle that started generations ago. Carl Jung spoke extensively about these intergenerational patterns. Then you can help interrupt this cycle. You don't need to do anything grandiose. Just ask yourself, am I treating my child's sensitivity as a gift or as a defect? The honest answer to that question can change the destiny of an entire person. It can break a generational chain. It can save a highly sensitive child from becoming just another adult, incapable of love. If this video resonated with something inside you, if you recognized your own story or the story of someone you love, leave a comment. Tell me, were you a highly sensitive child who learned to hide? Or do you know someone like that? I want to read every story. I want to know that this video reached the people who needed to hear it.